Whether you call it SKO or SKO, the season is upon us. Let's talk about sales kickoffs in this episode of Closing Time. Thanks for tuning into Closing Time, the show for go-to-market leaders. I'm Val Riley, Head of Content and Digital Marketing at Insightly CRM. Today, I'm joined by Geoff Hendricks. He's an AE at Challenger, a sales coaching business, and a double podcast host. Welcome to the show, Geoff.
Thanks, Val. It's great to be here today.
Geoff, we were both at sales kickoffs recently, and I just wanted to see what types of themes you're hearing in terms of sales kickoffs in 2024.
Yeah, Val. Well, as any good sales kickoff is wont to do, I think that pipeline generation is always top of mind. But I think what was really interesting, not only at our own SKO, but what I'm hearing out of a lot of sales leaders is not only a focus on pipeline creation, but on pipeline validation and the consequences that they were feeling towards the end of last year of not having confidence in their pipeline and how much it was impacting their forecast accuracy.
Yeah, I did hear a lot about that. Just it kind of shows up in stalled deals. Is that typically where you see it?
I think so. It's definitely one of the challenges that we see across the space. A lot of folks were really, really accustomed to having a predictable win rate and being able to know more or less where things were at and, sort of the law of averages, figure out what was likely to close. And I think what a lot of sales leaders experienced last year were those win rates declining. And a lot of, to your point, was because a lot of those mid to late stage deals that sellers were forecasting started to fall out a little bit more. And sellers were not being able to predict accurately which of those were likely to close and which weren't.
So it sounds like maybe some hangovers from 2023 are, sales velocity. Anything else that you've seen in terms of things that we might be bringing in from 2023 that we'd rather not?
I think if there's one thing that I think everybody can agree upon, it's that the buying environment is more challenging. And I have a lot of empathy for buyers out there because buying is almost a full-time job and they also have their own full-time jobs. And so what's interesting is, as budgets were certainly tightened last year, as there was additional scrutiny and spend, a lot of the weight fell on the buyer's shoulders to try to figure out if they could drive consensus. And I think that was, if we think of sellers, from our perspective, the stalled deals were frustrating. But from our buyer's perspective, it was also frustrating because a lot of folks were encountering situations that they weren't accustomed to. They weren't able to get their organization to say yes because folks, frankly, didn't want to make a mistake. And that's how tight budgets are today.
That even resonates with me as a buyer in the MarTech space. For instance, being challenged by the finance department or, being asked for more favorable payment terms. It is challenging as a buyer sometimes because you want to move forward. You feel like this is a positive step for your organization, but you are being questioned by your leadership or your finance team saying, how can we make this more palatable? Do we really need this? All those questions, it really does put that buyer in a tough situation.
And, as sellers, I think that it's our job to think about what are some of the things that we can do that can take some of the weight off of our buyers' shoulders. If I think about how we transition into next year, that's where I think a lot of the focus is in order to make sure that we're engaging with, one, the right buyers, and that we're also making their jobs as easy as possible.
Yeah, that's a great skill for a seller to develop. So speaking of skills that sellers may develop, on your podcast, I think you take a really fun angle in terms of talking to sellers, and you ask them, as sales leaders and sellers in general, what their biggest mistakes or misses are in their career. Tell me about that approach, because I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, I think, so what's really interesting is I did an entire career in consulting, and this is actually the first time I picked up a bag, so to speak. So this is my first sales job. And, you go on LinkedIn and you see all these people giving, usually great advice. Not all of it's great, but let's filter for our favorites. And you just think, wow, these folks have it all figured out. But you also realize they're 10, 15, 20 plus years into their career, and there's a reason they have it figured out. And what I love about this is it also brings in a classic like psychological concept that I love, which is called prospect theory. And that is around loss aversion. But I translated this to like, think about, when you made a mistake, was that more memorable, or was when you got it right the first time more memorable? And personally for me, it's all about, I think back and I think those mistakes really stand out, and they're, impetus, they're a reason for changing our behavior. And I love to uncover what some of those were so that folks, as they're 15, 20 years in, can tell us how they arrived at the place they are today. And so that's the whole thing behind it, because I feel like folks, one, need to understand like what's behind a lot of the advice that people give, and that these people aren't perfect. And two, that, even if we make mistakes along the way, those of us who are a little bit earlier in our sales careers, we have the opportunity to learn from them and to get better.
That's so true. I'll share an experience as a software company. One time we were in an RFP process, and one of the questions was, tell us about an implementation that failed. And I thought that, and I've done a lot of RFPs in my life, but that question really forced us to like stop and be introspective and give a candid answer. And I really do think that buying committee probably learned a lot about all their potential vendors just from that question, just from asking about a failure.
I love that question. It's kind of like an interview question, and it makes you stop and think about it, and hopefully give a below the surface level answer.
Yeah, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Challenger, because really Challenger is about looking at high performing sellers, and there are some out there for sure, and what they're doing well. So can you give me some background about how Challenger got started?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny, there's some pretty good parallels to today. If you think about the last recession we had, capital, budgets were even more tight because we were going through the mortgage crisis and the banking crisis and all of that. And the company that we used to be was called CEB, and they had a membership, and the membership said, hey, I'd love you guys to study, because we have this small group of sellers that are not only hitting goal, but they're exceeding it, when the rest of our team is sitting at 40% of goal. Like, what is it that they're doing differently? And so that was sort of the beginning of this whole Challenger thing. It was like, let's go out and study what these sellers were doing differently. And I think there were two real key things that we discovered there. Number one, we interviewed buyers and said, what do you care about? What is it that makes you pick one supplier over another? And essentially they said, like, look, company, brand, product, service, value, price, all that's table stakes. What really matters is the sales experience that the seller delivers, that they can show up with a perspective, provide me some insight, and help me corral all the people on my team to make a decision. So that was the buyer's perspective. And then from studying the seller's perspective, essentially what we learned is that there are, 5 profiles of how people tend to engage customers. And 4 of those do very well in terms of being average sellers. But 2 of those profiles stand out in terms of being disproportionate high performers. The lone wolf, who we're really not sure what they do, but they keep hitting their numbers, so we keep them around. And the challenger, which essentially delivered that sales experience that the buyer was looking for. And so essentially what we said is like, great, if there are these people with repeatable skills and behaviors, let's figure out a way to help the other profiles adopt some of them. They don't have to change everything, but if they can just adopt a piece of it and figure it out, they're going to do better, and they're going to do better for themselves and their families and their companies. And so that's essentially where the original concepts came from. And it led to, Harvard Business Review articles, best-selling books. And essentially the company has spent the past decade learning how to help organizations adopt those skills and behaviors.
I mean, it's a universal need for sure. Does the methodology look at certain parts of the funnel or certain stages of the sale, or is it just all up and down across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first it starts with a mindset shift. And it's really thinking about how I'm going to put myself in my customer's shoes, how I'm going to be thinking about their business and the things that matter to them rather than focusing on my products, my solutions, or, potentially the ROI that I could be delivering to folks. So first, it is thinking in a little bit of a different way. But if you think about it, you can apply that mindset shift anywhere across the sales process, whether you're doing top of funnel activities, cold outreach, engaging with folks, preparing for a discovery meeting. They're all activities I can do that put myself in that buyer's shoes and makes me think about their world. And on the back end, if you think about kind of that mid stage or closing process, I'm thinking about how can I ensure that we hit the dates and the key things that matter to my customer and work back from there. And what things can I take off their plate to make, contracting easier, to make procurement easier, and essentially be the professional seller that makes my buyer's life better and easier.
Yeah, that's super insightful. We've been talking on a few episodes in Closing Time about how sellers can de-risk the buying process for buyers, showing empathy to the seller's concerns about, not wanting to pick a poor product or have a failed implementation or a failed project associated with them for, a long time. Is that as part of the Challenger methodology?
Absolutely. And so what's really interesting, Val, is, essentially one of the key pieces that can really earn you trust is to be able to coach a buyer around the potential pitfalls. If we think about it, they're buying your product or service probably once every 3 years, give or take, more or less, maybe even less. And you live and spend every single day in that space. And so what are some of the common mistakes that you see that they would appreciate being coached around to avoid? And so that's definitely a key piece to the skills and behaviors that we've seen really help sellers shine in the eyes of buyers.
I know that topic's has come up in probably several sales kickoffs. So it's nice to hear that it's addressed in the methodology. So, you're in the training business. I have worked in the training business in the past, and it is challenging to get people to realize that training just doesn't happen once a year or at the seminar, that real learning happens year round all the time. What are some strategies that you might give to enablement teams or sales leaders to keep them in the mindset that learning has to be like a year round occurrence?
Yeah, I love your point there because it's so true, and it's backed up by science. Essentially, there's something called the forgetting curve, which is no matter how good a training is, if it's not reinforced, we lose a chunk of it. And the stat is you lose 87% within 30 days. So that's a lot of learning loss if it's not properly reinforced. And we just are coming out of our SKO, and the feeling, the energy, it's amazing, but it tends to dissipate. So what I would suggest if somebody is thinking about, how do I create any sort of shift, whether it's sales methodology or any really change management perspective, is to look at it from an organizational capability perspective. And so in the case of, say, like a sales methodology, you've got 4 key things that you need to kind of have rowing in the same direction. You have your message. So being able to provide folks an example of what a message is. Those are not your features and benefits. That is the things that matter to the customer. Your managers are so important. They are keys to coaching and reinforcing the stuff. Getting them involved early and often is essential so that they can keep this alive. Number 3, you got to teach your sellers the skills and behaviors that you want, mindset and tactical. And then number 4, and this is where you guys come in, it's making sure that your sales process, your CRM, like Insightly, are aligned to what you're asking your sellers to do. Your hiring process, all of the different aspects of that, are aligned to what you're asking them to do on a daily basis, so that it's natural for these types of changes to start to stick.
Right. So, yep, sales leaders, if you're out there, take that heed and make sure you are, keeping learning at the forefront so that you continually develop your team. Geoff, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in to Closing Time. Remember, you want to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell for notifications so you don't miss an episode. We will see you next week.